Good morning, everyone. I am Matt Clark, and welcome to the Veritas CFO podcast. Today, I'm excited to have Chris Henry, the Chief Operating Officer with KSM Transport Advisors, with me. Chris, welcome to the show today.
Oh, well, thank you. And thanks for having me, Matt. Good to connect.
Yeah, well, appreciate you taking the time today. And you're back home in Canada today, outside of Toronto, is that right?
Yeah, in London, Ontario. So halfway between Detroit and Toronto.
And how's the weather up there today?
Little chilly, but it's sunny, so I'll take that.
Yeah, well, we're finally got a break on the heat down here in Atlanta.
Mhm.
So overcast, a little rainy too, but at least it's not 90 degrees that we've had for a while now.
Boy,
Great. So yeah, I appreciated in talking with you in Birmingham at the McLeod conference back during the summer, and appreciate you taking some time today to go into a few more of the details of some of the topics that you discussed there. But before we get into those details, can you talk to us or share some details about KSM Transport Advisors and your work there and your experience prior to KSMTA?
for sure. So KSM Transport Advisors, many refer to it as KSMTA, were the transportation consulting arm or practice of KSM Business Services, which is a top 50 accounting firm, audit and tax firm, with a strong emphasis in transportation. So we work with over 200 trucking companies throughout North America now. So our operation, our focus is to help trucking companies, for hire, over the road trucking companies, better understand the profitability of their freight network. So where the profit is leaking out of their network, for lanes, for loads, customers, and vice versa, where that profit is actually accumulating. So we use a process called freight math to help our clients understand those situations, and then give them a game plan to improve over time. So it's a continuous improvement model that's math-based. So our tagline is math, not emotion, and that's what we bring to the table. Prior to joining KSM, I had 20 years in transportation. Most recent, most pertinent to our conversation is in 2014, I started a firm called Stack Up with my partner, Ray Haight. The purpose of that firm was to provide an online tool to allow carriers to compare and contrast their financial and operational performance. So it was a benchmarking service. And we grew that database and service to 230 trucking operations, reporting their monthly financial and operational statistics to us. So GL level data, as well as their operational stats to us every month. So that allowed them to see, how is my cost per mile on whatever line item it is versus others of similar size, type, operating mode, region, etc. So we grew that firm to 239 respondents, and we sold that firm in 2019. And I did spend some time after that subsequently with the Carrier's Edge, which is an online training platform based in Canada, but has over 3,000 clients throughout North America. But more importantly, I was part of their Best Fleets Drive For program, and that was is a program that recognizes top trucking companies from a driver perspective throughout North America. Really the only one of its kind and in existence. So have spent a lot of time observing strong, mediocre, and poor performing trucking companies, and so that's probably going to tie into our conversation today.
Yeah, great. And so even at the TCA, the profitability program, some of the carriers, smaller carriers I work with, benchmarking expenses, costs and expenses too. And I remember seeing some of your work there too. And it's helpful with carriers on certainly understanding of profitability there too. So talking about the going into the details more on freight math, which you touched on. So before digging too far into an example and the details there, a high level kind of a primer of what freight math is and
Yeah, so it starts with extracting about 70 different data points from the TMS that the client has. So we work with all major TMSs, but basically what we're looking to do is extract revenue, costs, and time and geography from the data set we get. So every week we're going in, grabbing a data set. So for every order and every dispatch, we're getting, pickup, delivery, we're getting the revenue, we're getting the geography. And what we're looking to do is establish a margin per day for every single order. So that margin per day is calculated by taking the total revenue minus the cost. So we establish a activity-based costing model when we start with each client, and that's largely driven by their general ledger data. And that allows us to say, okay, this is what a loaded or empty mile is going to cost you. And that allows us to then calculate a margin on every single mile and then on a per day amount. So for every order, we're able to calculate revenue minus costs. And then what we then do is divide it by the time it took to deliver that load. So that's one element that a lot of carriers miss, is the time it actually takes. So when most carriers, when we start with companies, our client engagements, they're looking at one-way profitability, point to point, and they're able to see, okay, this load generated X amount of revenue, very similar to this other load. They're both the same. They fail to bring time into consideration. So one might have taken 40 hours of transit time, the other may have taken 25 of transit time. So both those denominators are extremely meaningful from a profitability perspective. So when we take the margin after subtracting the cost, then we divide it by time, we're able to compute a margin per day, even a margin per hour for every load. So that's the first slice of understanding profitability, but that's still at the one-way, origin to destination. But then what we do to put it in the network perspective, because people have to think of it as a holistic, connection of lanes. We look at, on average, how did you perform going into the origin area for that load? So both loads as well as empty movements going into that origin area. So we establish a standardized geography, but we can say the average margin per day going into the pickup location was X. That we know the one-way statistics, origin to destination, that's calculated on the load by load basis. And then subsequently, we can look at how you performed going out of the destination area. So when you put all of those three combined calculations together, it establishes a score that tells us whether it added value to the network or it took value away from the network. So overall, we establish a network average, and then we can tell based on that whether it's adding profit or taking profit from your network. And from that point, we're able to slice and dice and isolate customers, specific loads. And that's where we start our recommendation engine as to, here are the things you need to do to improve your network profitability, and then also to improve your P&L profitability.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. Carriers I work with certainly look at revenue and cost per mile, and so the margin per mile. But I don't think I've ever seen a carrier calculate margin per unit of time, day or hour. How many carriers do you see that before you guys have started working with them calculate a margin per day?
There are a few, and the reason you don't see many is because it's very difficult. You have to have quality data going in, and time related data is one of the real poor sets of data from a carrier perspective. So there's a lot of fat fingers and a lot of I'll get to this later, or I'll just punch it in here. So we do probably 70% of our time in processing each week is spent cleaning time related data. Okay. So in order to give an accurate margin per day calculation on every load, we have to make sure that the logic that we see to catch exceptions or errors in time data is sound. And yeah, it's difficult to do properly. So that's why you don't see a lot of carriers doing it today. But hopefully that will change.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're kind of benchmarking customers and lanes and loads internally. Do you also benchmark externally, or is it kind of comparing apples to oranges?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to compare one carrier against each other because they have different cost base, they have different operating regions,
Okay.
and then the one thing that we don't do is we don't get down to the P&L net margin level, just because our mantra is you need to make decisions based on gross margin. What you do after with your money after gross margin is up to you.
Right.
But if you're running an operator, you need to be profitable from a gross margin perspective. So our standard cost profile that I mentioned, we calculate that is driven by the main variable cost drivers. So the driver comp, fuel, maintenance, insurance, and your other variable costs such as tolls and on-road driver expenses, things like that.
Sure, got it. All right. Well, it's a great high level on freight math. So, can you share, without going divulging any confidential information, a recent project that you had? What you saw with the carrier when you guys started, and then what the profile or profitability looked like after your assessment?
Yeah, so it's good you mentioned the assessment. So the typical customer journey for us is they start with what's called a freight math assessment. So it's a one-time 45-day exercise where we extract a year's worth of data. We go through and we highlight a recent 4-week period that we call a highlight period. And in that, we calculate, based on freight math, what we see as the expected benefit. And the expected benefit is broken out into 3 buckets. There is, pricing. So obviously, that's a bit of a challenge right now. Capacity management and basically network management. So, whether it's a 100 truck operator or 1,000 truck operator, the typical expected benefit is anywhere between 7 cents to, in the last year, we've had one that was 17 cents per total mile.
Wow.
So it's a very significant amount. And that, depending on the size, could be anywhere from, a couple $100,000 to, a couple million dollars that we recognize as on the table, that's achievable if you basically work with us and listen to our recommendations and take action. So the typical customer journey with our client base is they start with what's called a freight math assessment. So that involves us extracting 12 months of data from both their GL as well as their TMS. So we're getting load and dispatch level data, 70 different fields. And in that analysis, what we're doing is we're applying our standard cost, standard geography, and calculating a value, a score for every single load, for every customer, for every lane. And at the end of that, we construct what's called a highlight period. And in that highlight period, our main goal is to identify for the client, this is what your expected benefit is if you implement our model. And it's a guided model. We don't just give you the data. We actually, every week, every month, we're doing a sit-down meeting virtually, and we're highlighting things that have occurred in your network with a bunch of different tool sets that we have and saying, here's what we recommend you do. Is this doable? Sometimes they're not. If it is, what date do you think you can have that done by? And those can fall into, a bunch of different buckets, but the main ones are obviously pricing. You have pricing disparity between 2 customers on the same lanes. Capacity management, you don't get the opportunity to adjust the price on that customer, but you can adjust capacity. You own the trucks, you get to decide where the capacity goes. And then overall network management. So that involves understanding, what lanes fit well together, which ones don't, which ones are what we call spider lanes versus power lanes. Another part of it is understanding your franchise customers' loads, lanes versus what we call toxic lanes and loads, but they're all driven by that score that I talked about, that network-based score. So that's our really our key metric that we start our conversations with the clients with. But the expected benefit that comes from that freight math assessment can it be anywhere from 7 cents per total mile up to, in the last year, 17 cents. We had a client generate an expected benefit of 7 cents. So what that means is, in the next 12 months, if you implement this service, we believe a 17-cent additional amount to the total revenue per mile is doable, and a good chunk of that should flow directly to your bottom line. It should be accretive margin. So we've had a couple recent examples of clients that have achieved those values. A typical scenario, though, and I'm thinking of 2 clients, they come to us, and about a couple days into doing an analysis, one thing jumped out, and that is one customer, long-standing customer that controls a massive amount of their capacity and is underpriced. The lanes that they are giving them are not conducive to their network. A lot of low density lanes taking them everywhere. Essentially, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog scenario. So what this freight math allows us to do is to unemotionally say, this is what that customer is doing to your network. And a lot of times we'll see, 20, 25, 30% of the revenue is controlled by that customer. The typical response is, we've been with them for X number of years. They stuck by us in the recession, blah, 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 blah. And, they have these emotional connections to these customers, but to survive in trucking, you have to drop those ties. You have to look at it from a math perspective and trust that if it is a valued relationship, mutually valued relationship, you can go to them and say, hey, we have issues on these lanes. We have issues with pricing. Here's the benchmarks. Here's the profitability of this load on this lane versus another customer on the same lane. So you can have an educated discussion with them. And if they're unwilling to, consider pricing adjustments or capacity movements that may be more beneficial, then it's time to move on. It's, the writing's on the wall. So that's what we arm our customers with. And that's a very typical scenario when new clients start with us.
Yeah, it's awesome. 17 cents a mile. It certainly makes a hefty improvement on the bottom line, I'm sure. And it sounds like or maybe you've seen the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
That's it.
Have some of those types of clients too.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those similar discussions, we also identify imbalances in their network. So we can identify this area, has, a ton of freight going in, but very little freight going out. So that's a target for your sales team. And if they're unwilling to go there, that market's not, or that's not helping you from a profitability perspective. So that's one area, especially on the smaller mid-sized carrier point of view. They don't have a lot of ability to contemplate is where their imbalances are in their network.
Yeah. It certainly sounds like a great assessment. I'm sure the majority of your clients have to love it. Again, there's probably some that still, think they know better than you guys do, or still more emotionally attached versus, it's hard to disagree with math or numbers. So
that happens from time to time. Disagreements.
Yeah. So another one of the topics you talked about in Birmingham were these 12 traits of highly profitable trucking companies. Before going through the list that you've published so far, can you talk about what made you decide to work on this list and develop it and then publish it?
Yeah, so it was kind of funny how this all culminated. Obviously, I've had a lot of exposure to a lot of really well-performing trucking companies over the last decade since I started doing benchmarking. Our president, David Roush, he's had the same experience. So KSMTA has worked with over 150 over-the-road trucking companies since it started back in 2007. So we both would get calls on a weekly basis, what is someone doing here? What is someone doing there? What's a good idea here? What's a best practice here? Basically it was an unending stream, and it got us thinking, what if we could kind of take our observations and put it into kind of a nice consistent package. And we came up with this with the KSM marketing team, and that is to each month publish one of the observations that we see from these high performing trucking companies. So high performing for our perspective is you have to be quite profitable, above average from a profitability perspective. So if you're a dry van operator, an operating ratio over multiple markets below 94%, refrigerated carriers below 92%, and then flatbed carriers right around 92. So that's kind of our threshold for what is a highly profitable trucking company. But we also have done kind of a qualitative snapshot of the companies that are both profitable as well as consistent from a strategic perspective. So there are real companies behind each one of those traits, and some companies fall into each one of those 12 traits that we're highlighting over 2023. And the ones that we've published so far, they've been focused on transparency. That's a key trait that we've identified. An executive team that's willing to empower and delegate to their team. It's a very rare trait in trucking. Having data sanity versus vanity. So a lot of vanity metrics that get thrown out there and published by lots of different media companies. But they really are meaningless from a profitability perspective. So, revenue per truck per week, that tells you, you're adding more revenue, but is it actually quality revenue? Is it profitable revenue? What does it mean to your frontline or your middle management people? What can they do with revenue per truck per week? That's an example of what I consider a vanity metric, just like truck count. And we can go on forever about this, but the first thing that any trucking executive starts and ends their conversations with in a bar is, I got X number of trucks, but are they profitable trucks? What's your net margins? You don't hear about that. Legacy-based strategic planning. So focusing on, the deep future, not just, the next couple quarters. So, developing for the long term. Having a centralized pricing model. So having a team in the pricing department that can take into account both quantitative and qualitative factors, but is at an elevated level, an executive. We see too many pricing departments that, report to, one or two levels below a certain, department. So that's a key trait. The courage to shrink. So right now, that's probably or should be a very big discussion with carriers. So being willing to give up tractors, and that could be just natural attrition or doing it more proactively. So when you have a down market, it doesn't mean that you also have to have a significant downturn in margin, but in order to protect that margin, you need to potentially get rid of some customers and get rid of some trucks as a result. So that's one thing that we've identified. Understanding, where broker or what we call connector freight fits in a good, well-performing, healthy network. Network discipline, that's obviously a big part of what we do. And then the one that we're publishing this month is maintenance excellence. So those are the first 9 of 12 that we're going to be putting out there so far this year, and will be for the rest of the year.
Yeah. So you touched on the transparency, and I work with a lot of most of the carriers I work with are privately held, and so there's always this dilemma about how much, or if any, financial information to share. One of the surveys you mentioned in Birmingham is that you found that significant number of employees think that carriers have 62 cents left over at the end of the month for every dollar of revenue. So basically a 62% profit margin. I'd love to. I mean, there would have to be a great trucking company to work for. I just don't think there are that many out there. So, can you talk about why you think employees think there's 62% profit margin?
Yeah, so the purpose of that question was really to dismay concerns that typically owners have about being more transparent. So a great service is the great game of business. So that's a strategic planning and tactical tool and system that a lot of companies use. And one of their they're a very big proponent of being very transparent from financial. So trying to instill entrepreneurial attitudes, right down to the front lines. So we have encountered similar responses from owners. I don't want to be too transparent. People will be asking for raises, or, on the flip side, they're going to get too scared when, we have a really bad month. So with over 50 companies, we did a survey. It was part of a larger survey. And one of the questions we put on there was, out of $1 of revenue, and this was going out to all their non-driving associates, and in some cases, all of their employees, driving and non-driving. And one of the questions was, out of $1 of revenue, how much does our company keep in the form of profit? And without fail, there was always at least one response above 50 cents. And the record so far is 62 cents. And we've had multiple people from multiple companies respond at 62 cents of net profit. So that obviously gets a chuckle from the owners when we present those results, but it reinforces the fact that they don't know the gravity of the decisions they're making. A lot of those people, do you think that person who reported 62 cents would, if they're negotiating with a broker on a piece of freight, do you think they'd negotiate a bit harder if they knew the reality was 4 cents of net margin? So that's the purpose of that. And I'm happy to report a number of carriers that have taken that survey have become ultra transparent, are reporting financials to their monthly financials to their people on a monthly basis. And some have turned into ESOPs because of that. That transparency has generated that entrepreneurial aspect. And now the owners are saying, okay, I'm comfortable moving to an ESOP type format. So of ownership. So that was pretty cool to witness.
Yeah, that's great. One other one, touch on quickly is you mentioned the courage to shrink and establishing a minimum margin threshold. I heard you talk about Heartland Express as being a good example of this trait. Can you talk about what makes Heartland, or why you think Heartland is so impressive related to this courage to shrink trait?
Yeah, I think Heartland is a great example, not just because historically, I'll have to check my math, but I'm pretty sure it's still the case that they have, over the last decade, or they've been the one with the lowest operating ratio from a company, a non-LTL trucking company. And one of the things that they've demonstrated consistently is a willingness to shrink their operations in order to maintain a level of profitability that many people just don't feel is possible from a over the road trucking or truckload perspective. So one of the examples that I call out in that article and in our presentation is when they bought Interstate Distributor. About 6 months after they bought it, they made a release. It was an earnings release, but they basically stated that they're cutting off about X% of their 20% of the trucks that they had just bought. And the reason is they need to maintain profitability. So they're willing to make the tough call sooner rather than later in order to maintain that high threshold of margin and eventually profitability. And you hear lots of companies talk, lots of executives talk about how much they admire Heartland, but in the same breath, they're not unwilling to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so obviously that takes courage. It also, it's difficult to have those conversations because those are people behind, those trucks being jettisoned and, in some cases, non-driver roles being jettisoned, but you really owe it to your customers, you owe it to your employees, your long-term, strong performing employees to have a strategy like that. You need to, in order to get above average returns, you have to do things quicker and more proactively than others. So
yeah, it sounds like they're taking that trade about the sanity over vanity, rather than just trying to increase the top line, or trying to increase the bottom line and the profitability on the bottom line.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, but run out of bump against our time limit here, but really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with me. And so if listeners want to learn more about Freight Math or the 12 or I guess 9 traits you've published so far, where can they find more information?
Yeah, you can just go to freightmath.com, all one word, and scroll all the way to the bottom, and you can sign up for our Freight Math monthly newsletter. No obligation. It's 99% educational content. Can learn more about a Freight Math assessment if you're willing to go down that path as well on freightmath.com. But yeah, love to talk to you.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining, and that wraps up our show for today. Please leave any feedback or comments in the box below, and make it a great day. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Matt.